been said that you cannot drink yourself sober, neither can you borrow yourself out of debt. But it seems that the leaders of this region have not gotten that message, or have they? It's time to face the facts. Welcome to this edition. I'm Jerry George. We'll be right back with you in just a moment.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. This month, we're going to be looking at the seriousness of the Caribbean debt. Do we really understand the state of debt in this region and what it really means or could mean? That's what we'll be discussing. Joining me this evening are two able gentlemen who can help us. First, we have Mr. Michael Julien, who is a financial economist and strategy consultant of 30 years' experience internationally. And certainly I can tell you I've worked with Mr. Julien, and I can assure you this evening he's a man who knows his onions. And this evening also with us is Straghn. In fact, he has spent 4 years as an economist at the Central Bank of Barbados. He's now the managing director and CEO of Evelyn Consulting Services, a company that specializes in business and economic forecasting. I hope that tells you that we have two persons here this evening who can really help us look at this issue of debt. Gentlemen, first of all, let's talk about when we talk about debt in the context of the economy, is it any different to debt in the concept of the individual? Let me ask you first, give you first bite at the cherry, Michael.
Well, no, it isn't really. It's if you have a situation where you're in debt, you have to at least have the cash flow to service the debt, so that you can eventually pay it off. With governments, it's different because it's about managing the level of debt. So typically, if you had, as most of the African countries do, if you have a debt to GDP ratio of about 4 to 5%, that considers...
That's one of the first terms we want to define tonight. Yeah. A debt to GDP ratio. What exactly does that fantastic term mean?
Well, it means debt as a... GDP is an acronym, gross domestic product, which means a total of all the income of the country. So if you have debt measured as a share of that, it's an indicator of how healthy your financial situation is or is not. Typically, the IMF would say that if your debt to GDP was 45%, then you are relatively running a prudent economy. 60% is considered to be the maximum level of debt that your country should be at. And if you're above that, if you're at 80 or 100 or 120%, then you're approaching severe financial problems, which can only be rectified by you finding a way to collect more income from the population, which is in the form either of taxes or asking the population to pay for services that they used to get for free before. Or cutting back on your expenditure. So if you have a heavily staffed public sector, then you would want to consider ways of reducing that public sector so that you can have more positive cash flow, which would allow you to pay off your debts and bring them down to a manageable level.
Your take on debt and its importance.
Good evening, thanks again. Well, certainly what Michael would have indicated is quite true. And in the context of the householders, to answer your question on the other side, obviously from the household perspective, you can't necessarily reduce the size of your family. And so those are some of the issues that as a household, your level of debt relative to the household income is absolutely important to understand in terms of managing how much you take on, when you take it on, and so forth. Now, obviously, the household does not have ways of necessarily getting additional income other than to supply its services outside of that space. Whereas the government can, as Michael indicated, can at the drop of a hat pretty much increase taxes, fees, and so forth in order to help raise any additional revenue to service its debt potentially, or even to reduce the deficits that it may run. But certainly as it relates to the household, what is absolutely critical is your ability actually to service. I mean, and the debt service is absolutely important because what financial institutions or even individuals will want to know is how stretched are you as an individual household, and can I risk giving you some more? And I'm sure during the discussion we'll come to things like credit ratings and those kinds of things and what those mean. But certainly it really is a function of your ability not just to pay service your debt now, but looking forward, looking at what you plan to do and how obviously then you can ensure then that you have a smooth transition in terms of cash and management to service your debt, as well as do some of the other things that you have to do.
Let's look at it nationally. And nationally, we're here talking now about the countries of the region. Two countries in this region celebrated 50 years of independence this year. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago. In a sense, our national debt started after independence. Do you agree with that? We've gotten ourselves now, practically all of the countries of the region, in a state of debt that is unbelievable. How could this have happened in 50 years?
Well, certainly I think during the early stages, there needed to be a lot of infrastructural development in order for the economies to grow. And the region has seen some reasonably robust growth over those 50 years, as you would have mentioned. And obviously there would have been some shocks as well. But certainly I think in order to build a stable economy, you needed to have early initial investment in things like education and health, which I think were some of the more critical or the core elements that you needed for the economies to grow. Mm-hmm. Better trained personnel to enter the labor force. You needed obviously a healthy population, and that coupled with education obviously then meant that a lot of investment needed to go in, I think, in the early stages. And so the issue is whether or not we've gotten the return on that early investment. And so I think
when you say return again, I want us to really dumb down some of these terms, because the
return
purpose of this program, right, is
yes.
to get that person this evening in the elephant room understanding really what this business means, because I think in a lot of regard, the people of the region do not understand a lot of this stuff and they shy away from it. So let's try and make it as simple as possible.
Well, as simple as you can put it, you spent some money in these areas to get something. What that something is a system that works in the interests of the country, whether it's education or it's health. And the simple point meaning that you educate persons or you invest in health facilities to ensure then that the population is able to produce. Mm-hmm. So by return, what you're talking about is what are the levels of production within the economy? Are those production levels significant enough to help to repay for the investment that you would have made in those areas? And you would have made across a number of areas as well, infrastructurally and so forth. So the notion is, I think, given that all the countries would have spent heavily across those 50 years and continue to do so, I think the fundamental focus now has to be, have we spent the money
wisely?
As wisely as we should have, given that we've invested in education. And given that we've done so, have we spent the money as educated people should?
I tend to have a more historical view on why we're in so much debt. And,
Let's hear that.
And that is that prior to and leading up to independence, I mean, prior to independence, there was free movement of people throughout the Caribbean. I remember Dwight Venice saying that he had an aunt who traveled from country to country without a passport. But what happened just prior to independence was the rewriting of West Indian history, which had at its very core the establishment of the identity of each country as a separate and exclusive zone. And so because of that, we developed an obsession or fear of foreigners called xenophobia. And secondly, what happened is so therefore we created an environment in which there were only two major forms of investment in our societies. The first being government expenditure and all the things that Ryan is talking about, but the second being investment by invitation. So you could come to the country, you could get investment concessions, and you could run your business and make money, but you really weren't invited to be part of the society to live in the country, in the sense that
so you invested and you sent back out your money.
Yes.
And very little residuals was there.
So on top of that, we had something which has since faded away, but the effects of it have been quite significant on our societies, and that's called family planning. I think in the 1970s, family planning was introduced throughout the Caribbean, resulting in a reduction in the birth rates throughout the region.
And you think that was a negative thing?
So I'll tell you why it's a negative thing, because the growth rate, the population growth rate in Grenada is 0.5% a year, and in Barbados it's even less, it's 0.2% a year. Now the fertility rate, which is about 2.5%, is a rate that is required in order for your population to keep on a replacement growth path. So if you were to track out the population growth of, say, Suriname or Barbados or Grenada or Antigua, you'd find that over the next 20 to 30 years, the population rates are actually flattening out. And so one of the reasons why the governments are in so much debt is that the unit cost of a road, a mile of road, or another secondary school, or a new hospital or port facility is rising all the time. And the taxes that they collect from the consumers and the private sector is not enough to pay for those things, because the population base of our societies isn't growing at a rate that it should grow.
So there's no replacement of those revenues,
basically? Well, there is just no increase in consumption in net terms, that other than increases that are inflationary, and therefore you're finding that the government has to increasingly borrow and borrow and borrow more. There's no net return from revenues over expenditures. On top of that, most of the governments have inflated the staff, the employees in the public service, which means as fast as you collect revenue, you're just spending it back out in personnel expenditure. And I think that if you look at, for example, the population growth rate of the United States, which was about 150 million people in 1950, it's now 310 million. If you track any one of, I won't say anyone, but most of the Caribbean countries, you will find that the population growth rates have been relatively flat over that period of time.
We were told that it was important to manage the expansion of our population, and we got assistance from international bodies to do that.
Well, certainly, but a 0.2% growth rate is almost no net growth at all in your population base.
So we're building schools, large schools, and we're getting less and less people to fill them. Yes.
Well, to some extent, yes, because, for example, the teacher-to-student ratio has dropped in many countries below 20 to 1, whereas in the past there were less secondary schools, so now there are more secondary schools, but the schools cost money, and you have to repay the loans that you've taken out to build them. So where are those resources going to come from? What has also happened is that the governments have increasingly taxed the consumer base and the private sector to the point where it's very difficult for the private sector to actually grow any more than it's currently growing.
And in many countries, the government or the private sector significant sums. Barbados is one of those places. St. Vincent is another. So,
yes.
So you have a situation where they can't produce enough for the taxes they're paid, and they still are not paid for services that they produced.
Yeah, and that in of itself has created additional challenges. You've had the rise of informality. You've had people hiding from paying taxes. So you've had more and more informal businesses. In St. Lucia, I think 74% of the businesses, there are about 7,600 businesses there, and about 74% of them are hiring between 1 to 5 people. So you have a shift in the composition of the private sector, an avoidance of tax being paid as well by these people, and therefore it's becoming more and more difficult for governments to manage their books.
I want to go back to something you said. You've raised some really interesting points. I want to throw this one in. And this is something from Professor Trevor Monroe out of Jamaica. And he speaks to independence, the first that Jamaica had, and what it could have meant. Let's hear that one.
Towards the end of the 1960s, when Jamaica was amongst the fastest growing economies in the world, we received what was up until that point the largest loan to a developing country granted by the World Bank, and we received that loan for educational purposes, to build schools and institutions that would have been able to receive the influx of young people seeking an educational opportunity in the years after independence. The loan did not achieve its purpose as intended. There were immense cost overruns, 100%, which contributed to the beginnings of our debt, and which, had we not had those overruns, we could have built 50 more schools. Reason? Partisan, political award of contracts, not on the basis of merit, not on the basis of competence, but on the basis of party connection.
Just to recap that, he is saying the first loan that Jamaica received was for education. But because it was squandered, it formed the basis of Jamaica's debt problem today, from 1960. You were making that point.
I think the interesting part of that is really related to the fact that what is called, I suppose, misappropriation or what have you, it really is corruption at the heart of, and it forms part of the debt profile across the Caribbean. Because
how bad is it?
Well, it's a difficult thing to measure, because when you hear terms like cost overruns, it sounds reasonable, you know, something happens and it costs more. But I think fundamentally it goes down to the fact that we are not critically analyzing how we are spending money, who we are giving contracts to, whether they're competent from the outset. And then there's you need to have constant management to ensure that any money that's expended, you actually can account for, and you're getting the results. And I think that there's a fundamental, a serious lack of that across the region. And as a result, when you look at it collectively over the years, if a project, if you're conservative and say that a project is overrun by 10%, and every project, and I'm sure that your listeners will know from in their countries, there are a number of projects that have had cost overruns. But when you add that as part of the, analyze that across the entire debt profile for 50 years that you're talking about here, then you can see, given the level of debt the rate it is today and what is required to finance it, as I said at the very beginning, we simply have not spent the money in as wise or efficient a manner as we should. And it really is something that we need to get a handle of very, very quickly so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we made in the first 50 years of this Caribbean experience.
I want to come back to that. Do we have the time? But you raised the issue of not enough population as being one of the big things. Would you therefore say, because you said before that we moved about, has independence been a bad thing then?
For the region, given the scale of the size of the region, we should really just be one country. You know, it should be one country consisting of a number of territories. I remember having a discussion with a gentleman from the Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India. And he said to me, your problem is one of fierce independence. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, do you know how many people that we have in India in the House of Representatives? And at the time, India's population was 600 million. And he said, we have 600 people, 600 representatives, 1 per million. So if you take the population, the political representatives, the number of them in just the Eastern Caribbean alone, you would get possibly 15 by 700 and well over 120, 130 representatives for less than a million people. Just to put it in sort of perspective. And a lot of resources are wasted on the fact that you have too many countries duplicating too many things. And I know that's not what probably some of your viewers are wanting to hear, but it is a matter.
This program is not about what people want, it's about what they should hear.
It's a matter of scale, and we should all be one united country. But really, that's what the Caribbean should be.
Some people might say you're aspirational on that, right? So,
yes,
but I agree with you.
Let me just add a bit on that, because in terms of the migration across the region, the fundamental thing is that labor needs to go where it is required at any point in time.
Hold your next thought. We must go to a break at this point in time. This is Time to Face the Fact. We're looking at the burden of debt of the Caribbean. Do you understand how much it is, what it means, and what it can do for you? We'll be right back in just a moment.
Sending money to your children studying overseas is easy. Western Union's safe and reliable service lets you transfer money everywhere in the world. My son is doing well at school. That makes me proud. Western Union, moving money for better.
Agents in Grenada, Rennick Thompson and Company, with locations in Grenville, Sauterres, Guave, Grand Anse, the Carenage, Bruce Street, and Carriacou.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
Welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. It's a chilling story, the death of the Caribbean. And helping us to understand what it means and what we can perhaps do about it is Mr. Michael Julien and Mr. Ryan Straghn. I think I caught you when we were going to the break.
No, I was saying in terms of migration and the fact that the populations are relatively small, what is important is that labor helps is important that the labor is able to move around the region, so that actually helps to supplement the domestic population, drive business activity up. And that's something that I think is fundamental, and Michael is absolutely right about. Prior to independence, people moved around freely. And it is something that, for whatever reason, our leaders and even perhaps to some degree the populace in each
well, the populace has taken its lead from the leaders on this issue.
To some degree. But I think it is important for people to realize that migratory labor is important to helping to solve some of the debt issues, because it allows economies to grow in the absence of increased fertility up and down the region, and it's something that we have to come to grips with. Michael would have mentioned the growth rate in the United States over the last, certainly over the last 50 to 75 years, but that is primarily driven in part by migration.
Yes, inward migration.
And
it's interesting because a lot of our Caribbean people have gone
there,
and we struggle to move around ourselves.
I mean, there's an interesting statistic where 14% of the U.S. population are immigrants, but 52% of the companies that own businesses in Silicon Valley are owned by immigrants. So inward migration, which is something that we haven't actually thought about in the Caribbean, is well worth thinking about today. Because it has a powerful force in terms of its inflow of new ideas, people who want to do things differently, people who come with networks. But because of the history of the Caribbean, because of our first independence, we tend to shut out that option completely. In 1783, a young Grenadian left Grenada and moved to Trinidad, cut a deal with the Trinidad government at the time, in fact with the King of Spain, and moved 5,000 people from Grenada to Trinidad, along with 50 plantation owners. And that became the new birthing of Trinidad and Tobago, which then led to sugar cultivation and cocoa production, and then of course the transition into oil and gas.
Listen, I've read enough of Caribbean history. I haven't seen that.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Is our history really what it is?
Well, that's a whole different subject matter.
Which I'll hold you on one of these days. I'll get you to talk about
that. That's a different topic, but we have ignored the benefits of inward migration. That's what I'm saying. And it's a highly valuable thing. If you look at the offshore financial services in Barbados, it's brought tremendous benefit to Barbados, because when those people come here, they come with a certain degree of professionalism. It challenges the Barbadians to raise the quality and standard of the work that they do, to step up to the plate and meet that level of professionalism. They rent properties, they create stimuli for new business opportunities to be developed in the country. And of course, the logistics of the country becomes more viable. The airport becomes more viable because you have more people coming and going. It helps to foster something which we haven't spoken about, which is wealth creation. Because in order to get out of the debt situation that we're in, you need to have a wealthier population so that they can pay taxes without having to impinge on their own net incomes and withhold.
But isn't it, wouldn't you say, because one of the last reports from the IMF made this point, that if the region is to get out of this current situation, there must be more opportunity given to the private sector?
Well, The only way that the economy grows is when the private there's actually business activity happening in the country.
Okay, so I'm asking next: is the government too often overshadowing the private sector in the region?
That may very well be the case.
No, I want to know if it is the case.
But I mean, you know, I think the private sector, you know, the private sector is the engine of growth. Became a slogan, and when you actually looked at the underlying numbers, particularly for the Eastern Caribbean, excluding Barbados, I don't have the numbers for Barbados, but I do know that the trend in investment by the private sector between 2000 and 2005 was downwards, whereas the trend in investment by the public sector was upwards. So what happened was that the private sector began to become complacent and to simply develop an expectation that economic growth would be always driven by public sector investment. So
now that has fallen off.
So now that has fallen off, the private sector is crying and lamenting that and blaming. I'm not a protector of the government. I'm not saying that they've done an extraordinary good job, but the reality is you have two problems. You have a debt problem which you have to resolve, and you have a private sector that's not as entrepreneurial as it may seem to be. And the growth of the informal sector, of course, is squeezing the returns that the formal.
Let's explain the informal sector. You mentioned it a while ago.
The informal sector are people who have found ingenious ways because of access to information on the internet. And because they've become quite adept at running businesses without having a physical space, a formal structure, an established place of business. So, for example, if you have someone who's doing printing out of their home, they are competing with someone who has a business, equipment, machinery. They have to pay back for that. They have to pay commercial rents for the space that they're in. They have to pay all the benefits associated.
Introducing new fast-acting Advil with an ultra.
So what happens is that the formal business finds that it's not growing as rapidly as it could because it's losing some of its market share to the informal provider, and therefore is forced to either hold prices or drop prices, which means that the return on investment is lower, which means that the amount of time that it takes to replace the equipment and to upgrade the business is longer. So the informal sector, which is a positive thing from the point of view of self-initiative and job creation, also has on the negative side downward pressures on improving the productivity of the economy.
But let me throw something at you. The printer might have started in his house and built his business to that.
Yes.
Is it a fair competition in the region where we're looking at the informal sector as a threat?
I think the informal sector doesn't want to leave the house. I don't know that may be a prejudicial statement, but the avoidance of taxes is such that perhaps they've found a happy balance between working out of their homes and avoiding taxes and creating.
Well, that person is not an entrepreneur because the person doesn't plan to grow their business.
Well, if you look at some of the statistics for the Eastern Caribbean, you find that about 75% of the businesses in the Eastern Caribbean islands, not so Barbados, only 49% of them complain about unfair competition from the informal sector. That's one thing.
Well, I'm putting it to you.
The other thing is it takes
fair of competition, generally speaking, in business in the region.
Yeah, there's a fair of competition all over the world, I think. It's not something but if you dismantle the formal structure of business, if it begins to unfold, then again the tax base that the government has begins to decline, because these formal businesses will make less money and therefore pay less taxes to the government. So, I mean, a study was done on Brazil which showed that the informal sector is having a significantly negative effect on the economic growth of Brazil. So, you can have, when I talk about informal in Brazil, you're talking about huge supermarkets that are not registered in the system and simply operating.
Huge supermarkets.
Yeah, supermarkets, yeah. Because it's a much bigger economic environment. But getting back to the Eastern Caribbean, something has to be done to convert the informal sector to encourage them to become formalized.
I want to read something here for you. This is out of a document, and the document is the New Frontier for Caribbean Convergence, Integration Without Borders. And it is done, it's been put together by Mr. Winston Ducran, Finance Minister in Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to show you where the mindset is. The first page of this document, I just want to read something here. In the 40 years since its birth, the Caribbean integration movement has today reached its limits. Consequently, there's an urgent need to respond to the current realities and the emerging global trends, which require greater engagement from, listen to the people who it's pointing out, the public, students, academics, and policymakers. Nowhere in that statement is the private sector quoted. And I am putting forward that a lot of what is wrong in the Caribbean is this ignoring of the private sector. Yes, the private sector has its issues, and I'm with you in that. But is the system really paying attention to upholding, supporting, and promoting the private sector?
I think that in terms of public policy, I think it's to a large degree actually the public sector views the private sector as competitors. In a very small space. I mean, and the Caribbean is small, and when you look at each island, it's even smaller. And I think that to some degree, the omission of the private sector there is alarming, to be polite. But certainly the private sector, I think, as you said, they have their own issues, and I think part of the general problem with the private sector in the region that it's still very traditional. And to some degree, they're not seeking to grow outside of their own space. So when you talk about lack of competition, when companies move across from border, there's generally speaking a large outcry from the domestic population. When there are in a number of cases, there are companies in the domestic space that could also move out, but don't. And so therefore you have a situation whereby because the domestic private sector in each territory are very cautious and in certain instances I think perhaps rightly so, but in this new environment of globalization, more integration and what have you, you have to go where the opportunities are. And at the end of the day, whether it's a Trinidad company or a Jamaican company or a Barbadian company, it's going to be somebody's going to come knocking at your door. So you have to respond, and therefore the message is to the private sector across the region is that where opportunities exist, you have to go and you have to get up and go and make sure that you make the most of those opportunities.
I see Michael smiling. I wonder what's on his mind.
it is, but no,
well, I think that the private sector, that because again of the shortage of inward flow of new people, that the private sector has actually reached a lot of its limits in terms of its creativity. I'm talking about the formal private sector. That's part of the reason why the informal sector has grown so rapidly.
We're talking about the private sector because the World Bank and IMF has given some monies to a growth fund for the region.
Yeah.
They've put significant monies in there. The truth is, right, I went to the initial conference, was invited to the initial conference in Jamaica. There was a lot of talk about it. I haven't heard anything that continues. And the problem again is because there seems to be a lack of that crossover between the public sector to whom the money is given to empower the private sector. Now, I always feel it should go the other way, but let us assume for the reason of this discussion, it is what it is. We have debts. You say we need to service those debts. We need to find revenues to service those debts. If the growth is not there, how do we get out of this mess?
Well, Antigua just cut its over 3 years, cut its debt to GDP ratio from 120% to 80%, and it did so by cutting drastically government expenditure and also expanding its tax base so that it could collect more money to service the debts, and also worked on, I think it did work on some social programs, making consumers have obligated to pay for some share of that as well. So it will take perhaps, and that's a commendable move by Antigua. So But in the short term, it will mean that the domestic economy will get relatively tighter, that people become much more cautious about spending in the economy because the taxes have risen. And it will take 5 to 10 years for us to bring the debts down if we are systematic about it. Now, in Europe, for example, the debt to GDP ratio on average is about 38%. The revenue to GDP, the tax revenue to GDP is 38%.
Again, explain what that ratio means.
Well, it means the taxes collected as a percentage of total income is 38%. Whereas in the Caribbean, particularly in Barbados, it's about 30%. And in some of the other islands, it was moving up towards 30%. But with the growth of the informal sector, I think it slipped back down to the low 22, 23, 24%. So there is some scope for increasing taxes to collect additional revenue.
That's a political hot potato.
Of course it is, but recently in Grenada, the Prime Minister, there was what was called a barrel program, where you import barrels and you pay very little taxes on it, and he announced that such a program would have to stop because of the tax leakage out of the system, which is, I think, a commendable thing and a politically brave thing to do, because obviously the people who are mostly affected are poorer people who are going to react to that quite negatively.
But when would we stop that business of political expediency versus economic reality? Let me go to a man who was in the central bank.
That is a hard question, because obviously the considerations for economics these days seem to be severely lacking, because when you examine the decision making of policymakers across the region, politics always seems to be at the center rather than the economics. And at this point I think in the development cycle of the region post-independence, approximately 50 years afterwards, we really must ensure going forward that the politics, I mean, in terms of, and Michael mentioned a number of things that would have been done in some of the countries that are commendable, but the issue is that
commendable from what point of view?
From the point of view that somebody has actually done something to try to arrest the problem.
Oh, that's Antigua.
The issue is that you always have opposition politicians who will come and say and promise all kinds of things. In some instances, we actually try to go back to the way things were, which obviously then will only create more, I suppose, a more dire situation than you would want. But the thing is that because we're small, that creates a problem from the point of view that because we know some of the people that are directly involved, we don't want to hurt. It's our friends and family.
I mean, you have to ask the question whether it's the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail.
That's the question.
I think that the voters are controlling the politicians, and I think in countries where
really,
I think they are. I think the way it works in very simple terms is that if the politicians don't get jobs for everyone, that they live in fear that they will be voted out. They promise that because remember that the economies have shifted away from agriculture into services, and therefore there is a shift of the population base to urban areas where there is a greater pressing need for jobs. So if you want people to vote for you, you have to be reciprocal and say, I'm going to give you jobs. And then, of course, you blow up the size of the public service to give them the jobs. And you create programs that would allow them to feel, the population to feel and to believe that the people that they've voted into office are actually delivering on.
We must take a break, and we'll come back to that issue of what is called the counter-cyclical measure when we come back after this break. This is Time to Face the Facts, and we're looking at the state of the region's debt. Don't go away. We'll be right back with much more.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
It's the end of the month again. My son's rent is due. Sending money to your children studying overseas is easy. Western Union's safe and reliable service lets you transfer money everywhere in the world. My son is doing well at school. That makes me proud. Western Union, moving money for better.
Agents in Grenada, Rennick Thompson and Company, with locations in Grenville, Sauterres, Guave, Grand Anse, the Carnage, Bruce Street, and Carriacou.
Welcome back, and I hope you've heard some very interesting comments so far in this discussion, and during this segment we've given the telephone lines for you to call and to make your contribution, and we really want this to be a deep discussion. We have two gentlemen here, Michael Julien and Ryan Straghn, and I'm sure they can help us. When we went to the break, you're talking about the governments, when they see things going down, they spend to try and counter-spin it. Is that what I understood you to be saying, Michael?
No, I'm saying that I think there's greater expectation on the part of the population for jobs and job creation. And so in a way the governments have lost their way because they're thinking always just the number one priority rather than looking at how to construct an economic system that would lead to wealth creation. They're thinking only about how to create jobs
for the next election.
For the next election, and but there it is not something that they are doing without being acutely aware that there is a genuine pressure from the public, from the voters, for them to create the
I
jobs.
hear that, right?
Yeah.
But are politicians telling us the truth? The real truth about the state of our economy. I have this document here from the International Monetary Fund, and when you read that stuff, it's chilling. And you wonder how many people actually know what's in there.
Yes. You mean the assessment they did in May?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, it's quite.
But I want to come back to the business of when the things go down, they spend. It's called counter-cyclical. They go against the grain of stuff. And this was something that was practiced in England, and the Prime Minister Jim Callaghan spoke to that issue. Let's hear what he had to say.
You used to think you could spend your way out of recession and increase employment by boosting government spending. I tell you that option no longer exists. And so far as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step.
1976, Jim Callaghan had to go for the first time to the IMF for funds. But in the Caribbean, we're practicing that.
Well, basically, I mean, there's that, I suppose there's a big issue related to public sector employment and its effect obviously on private sector employment in the long run, and obviously growth. Because as we said, we said here, there can be no growth in the economy really without private sector activity. And so what we should be focusing on as counter-cyclical in terms of should be projects that will earn foreign exchange certainly for the country and in revenue generating going forward.
You go on to one of my pet things, right?
But unfortunately, because of the demands for jobs and what have you are from the public across the region, and elections are always around the corner because you never know. In this in this neck of the
so perhaps we should have terms. Term limits.
Well, whether terminus or not.
Limited term, but a known date for election.
A known date. But fundamentally is that the way that we operate is not rational at all.
Would you say that prime ministers and leaders are not rational?
They're not rational because they're not necessarily making decisions in the interest of the country. But as you said, you're looking to win the next election. And winning the next election means most of the time, a year and a half, a year out from the elections, generally the government start to spend more on things that really and truly aren't the priorities for the country. But it is solely on trying to help the whatever parties in power to win the next election. As a result, the debt goes up simply because you continue every 5 years or whatever on average. Everybody does this. You spend some money to help you win the election on things that not necessarily definitely don't earn any revenue, certainly. And so therefore that also adds to the debt, to the cumulative debt over time. And so therefore that's not rational by any stretch of the imagination. So when you hear you have to pay more taxes now, it is because we've all participated in this facade of allowing the politicians to spend to help them to win elections. That's part of the story of this whole debt profile over the last 50 years.
I mean, there is also the absence of the use of public accounts committees, which are written into.
But they're there. But when you hear from them, it's like 10 years later.
But then many of them are not activated, and there aren't, unlike Switzerland, where you have to have referendums for decisions that would affect you as a society. There aren't those checks and balances in place in the Caribbean, so the politicians will just keep borrowing until they can't borrow anymore.
And we want to go to what happens when that happens.
Yes, certainly, but you have to have in place mechanisms to say, okay, for example, if you were lenders today and wanted to give the governments a break on the debt, you would have to insist that there would be some trigger mechanism beyond, at some point, 50% of debt to GDP ratio or 60%, where the government couldn't borrow unless it went back to the public and sought the public's endorsement, explaining to the public what the implications are of borrowing beyond 60% debt to GDP. But we have none of those financial controls in place.
Listen,
so therefore you just borrow until you can't borrow anymore.
The attitude in the Caribbean is by leaders is that when they've gone to an election and they got a mandate, they have a mandate for the next 5 years. Whatever they do in that period is their mandate gotten 5 years ago. And clearly it's not working. This is very clear. But going back to something you mentioned there, that business of spending on projects. A lot of the capital projects that we hear about, huge sums of money are being spent, but no returns on the other side of the sheet. You said they get to the stage where they can't borrow. How far are we from that in the region? A region that has 19 billion US dollars of debt.
Yeah, we're pretty much at the limit of borrowing at the moment, but one must remember that what happened when the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, that there was a lot of money floating around looking for homes to park, to find a place to park, and there were one or two American companies going around the Caribbean enticing governments to borrow as much as they could get out of the market at very high interest rates. And that's what caused over the last, one of the reasons why the debts just mushroomed out of control, because there was just a lot of money being thrown at the countries, and the countries had a sovereign obligation to pay back the debts regardless of what happened. If you would push your people into poverty, tax them to the hilt, the lenders didn't care. So that's one of the reasons why we got into so much debt. I remember being in Jamaica in 2000, I think it was in 2002 or 2003, when a $400 million issue was oversubscribed 3 times by potential lenders, the government issuance of debt. So it's also externally induced. Now that we're in a situation where money is a lot tighter all around the world, suddenly it's a much more difficult thing to borrow than it was in the past.
Well, I mean, let me just add to that, the issue of credit ratings. What that allowed some of the countries to do, obviously, was to borrow at reasonable rates. Having graduated, most of us kind of graduated from the concessional loans that we used to get from the World Bank. And to some degree, that actually is also part of the story, because you were able to go to the market, get what was reasonable rates, but still high. You borrowed large sums, bringing the cost down. But obviously, if you're not spending that money on things that will actually earn foreign exchange going forward, then that creates the problem in terms of having not just repaying, but certainly know that things like capital inflows into the region have slowed significantly. Now it creates a problem now in terms of managing the existing reserve stock across the region. And that's where now, again, with the private sector and governments seeing the private sector as competing with the said reserves, and there lies part of the problem in terms of getting growth and managing to the country's reserves.
I want to expand on that, the competition there, because I get the sense of you saying, okay, there's a stock of foreign exchange that we have here. Yeah. The private sector goes out and starts to spend that to create, and the government is concerned. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And I think it is in part because capital inflows into the region have slowed. And they're mindful that we are no longer as attractive, because I mean over the last 10 years, for sure, I mean you've had defaults, you've had lots of debt restructuring, you've had lots of downgrades in the region. So therefore, as a region, we've lost our shine, so to speak, in terms of not just our credit worthiness, but certainly and particularly even here in Barbados, in terms of the attractiveness as a destination for investment. And I think in the region, that's why you've not seen large projects really. I mean, with the exception of maybe Bahamas, we've not seen large projects actually come into fruition because you've not been able to attract the investment that we used to. And I think that of itself is, in terms of that lack of capital inflows, is why certainly monetary authorities and governments are concerned about the private sector spending to even boost growth in the economy. So we're between a rock and a hard place, because you need growth, which means the private sector has to spend money, which will demand foreign exchange, but at the same time we're not getting that external investment coming through. And I think that really is, as it stands right now in the region, that really is I think a large part of our problem here.
I mean, the question is why we're not getting investments coming in. And I did a very sort of personal study of how long a sector would last in terms of contributing to economic prosperity in the region. And none of the sectors since the year 1750 coming forward have contributed to economic prosperity for more than 50 years. After 50 years, you continue to contribute to economic growth, but increasingly on a marginalized basis. We're all depending heavily on tourism, and tourism's time is up. I mean,
bananas time.
Tourism, bananas also is more than 50 years and has dissipated. But tourism is showing all the signs of a mature economy, a mature sector. Sorry.
Industry.
the returns have slipped. Smaller hotels are in a lot of trouble. There is product differentiation in the sector, so that you have the higher end hotels seemingly doing a lot better than the budget or average priced hotels. You have increasing subsidies being put in place for air transport into the Caribbean, so we're beginning to subsidize the sector. And we seem to be just stuck in not understanding that properly and not realizing that we have to make another strategic jump into a newer sector, into areas where wealth creation perhaps sustainable for another 30 or 40.
What would be your recommendation in that regard?
Well, it would be difficult to. We are consultants, right? So we don't want to give away the trade secrets.
Put it this way: you could give it to time to face the facts, and we'll hand it out.
Yeah. But I think to answer the question, I have to say that first the Caribbean has to understand what wealth creation is all about. Now,
but isn't there a struggle, isn't there a struggle that we have with wealth? Because in the Caribbean, we seem to struggle with wealth and we struggle with profits. The moment you mention profit, yes, it's like a bad word.
Yes.
You mention wealth, it's another bad word.
Yes.
So how are we going to get past that?
Well, it's going to be educational in terms of the way you go about changing the way society. In some Eastern Caribbean islands, you look at a wealthy man as being
evil.
Sort of an evil person. He's obviously being a crook, a thief, a rogue. Some investors come into some of the islands. Everyone says they're obviously crooked, they're not good. And wealth creation needs to be looked at as something that the society is very proud of and willing to endorse and put a lot of kudos on and say, yes, you know, we're very proud of what has happened. I remember attending a meeting in Jamaica where Michael Lee Chin, who became possibly one of the richest men in Canada, and was of Jamaican born professional, came back to Jamaica, and he was welcomed with open arms by the private sector. Everyone was proud of him, you know. But but going back to the issue, not understanding wealth creation. So if you go back, the model of wealth creation, which the Western world, the OECD countries perfected, began in the year 1200 when there was one economic zone in Europe which was thriving, and everyone wanted to figure out, well, why were they doing better than the rest of Europe? So the British government sent a team of people over to look at what they were doing and came back with the formula that they were using. And this formula was actually repeated, started in Bruges, which is in Belgium, then it went to Italy, it went to Venice, then it went to Genoa, then it moved from Genoa, I think, to Antwerp, and Amsterdam, and then London, and Boston, New York, and finally Los Angeles. And it had three essential components to it. So the formula hasn't changed for over 800 years. And the formula goes like this. One, you must have, as a principle, as a policy, lots of talented people in one central place. You must have lots of smart people in one central place. And they must be quite diverse.
And smart doesn't necessarily mean academics.
It doesn't mean academics, it doesn't even mean scientific. It could be very creative people in the arts and sciences mixing with people who with an engineering orientation. But there must be a concentration of them in one place. That's the first thing. The second thing is you must make unique products. You must be producing products like the Apple iPhone, which is assembled in China for $187.50 and sold starting price in the US when the new versions come out is $600–800. And the third thing is you must be a logistical center for something. So you must be a shipping hub, or in the case of Los Angeles, you must be a center for telecommunications, for ICTs. Now we have never understood that model because the British government deliberately set about, in discovering this solution, in this formula, they set about to discourage all of their former colonies from making anything. So they had a policy, the Tudors had a policy whereby they would say, whether it's India, whether it's Africa, whether it's Ireland, whether it's the United States or the Caribbean, no product will be manufactured in those countries. In 1770, the Americans said to the British, you know, we think instead of sending you all the products, the raw materials, we could make, no. The British said, no, we can't. That's against the rules. In 1850, the Irish said that they had more sheep per square acre of land, and they should share the wool and actually make clothes. And the British said, no, you can't. No, so what has happened is we have had a legacy of hundreds of years of not understanding the model of wealth creation. So instead we have sort of gotten into marginally viable industries and sectors, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago.
I was just going to mention that.
But we've got into chicken rearing and making juices and so on.
But clearly Trinidad and Tobago has gotten this message, because when you look at what is happening in Trinidad today, there's a lot of these business farms that are being built out, and they clearly are positioning themselves to be the manufacturing giant for the region. There is, in my mind, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And they're using some of their energy resources to put all of those things in place. And they realize it's important to manufacture. I look at them and I think, they got something going for them. And it's only a matter of time before it really explodes in our faces.
Agreed. They've taken the wealth creation model, but Barbados has also taken the wealth creation model and worked it quite well to some extent. The tourism product has been reshaped. I know that there are hotels under threat here. Offshore financial services has come along quite well, although they're facing increasing competition from places like BVI and Cayman and Bermuda.
And just now Cuba.
But the reality is that most of the islands don't understand the model, and because they don't understand it, they don't lay out a set of criteria to encourage wealth creating activities over and above other things. So it's all about all investors are welcome, all jobs are very positive and should not be discouraged. Investment concessions, Antigua and St. Lucia grant 25-year tax holidays to foreign investors. Grenada granted one tax holiday to a new hotel for 29 years, with 15 years or 14 years, I think, of VAT. So when you is that wealth creation? Because what ends up happening is that you get more and more tax leakage out of the system, and you have lower tax revenues relative to what the government's needs are for reinvesting in the economy. So, yeah, I haven't answered the question about what they should get into, but
I'd leave you. Tell me, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, but you have to first understand what the basis is of wealth creation before you can start developing a strategy to build it out of your
Okay,
system.
let's take a break at this point, and we'll come back. And when I come back, I want to look a little bit more at the IMF report and where their focus, as opposed to yours, seems to be. This is Time to Face the Facts. The state of debt in the region is under the microscope. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
It's the end of the month again. My son's rent is due. Sending money to your children studying overseas is easy. Western Union's safe and reliable service lets you transfer money everywhere in the world. My son is doing well at school. That makes me proud. Western Union, moving money for better.
Agents in Grenada, Rennick Thompson and Company, with locations in Grenville, Sauterres, Guave, Grand Anse, the Carenage, Bruce Street, and Carriacou.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
Welcome back. This edition of The Debt of the Caribbean. In fact, I read something from the IMF report, and it is called the silent debt. I decided when I saw that in the report that we need to turn the volume up on this debt. The Caribbean debt is seen as the final debt. But when we went out, you spoke of this business of not understanding the model. Each time I read of these reports, I hear of the role that disaster is playing in creating the debts that we have. What are your views on that?
Well, certainly, after any natural disaster, the onus is on the government really to ensure that normal services.
I hear that, but my question is basically is this: have we had that number of disasters in the region that we can claim have driven us to where we are?
I don't know that it's so much the number, but the intensity. I think the intensity is probably more important than the actual number and the frequency. Right? Certainly, for a few countries, that may be the case. For a lot of us,
but that's my point. This report says it is the issue.
It is. I mean, St. Kitts and Grenada, Jamaica, you can think of, and Haiti, in particular, you can point to and say, okay, those are countries that have had serious damage from natural disasters. But certainly for the rest of the region, that is definitely not the case. And so, even though you will get minimal damage as we are in the hurricane season now. So therefore, there's always damage going on, flooding and what have you. But I don't think the intensity is the reason for the collective debt levels across the region. For specific countries, yes, but definitely not across the entire Caribbean.
I'm not sure, I don't have the statistics. I understand that there's a 10% probability of being hit by a hurricane or having a natural disaster now every year in every Caribbean country because of global warming. So, but it's a bit like being invested in agriculture. You have to factor in, a bad year, drought, etc., or flooding. You have to factor that into your economic model, so that as a country you have to say, okay, let me incorporate an assumption that we will be hit by some natural disaster, and we need to factor that into the level of debts that we can have at a sustainable level going forward.
I just find, quite frankly, that the amount of times I've seen in this report the impact of disaster, I live here. And outside of Grenada, how many years ago? I'm sorry. And I'm saying, are we just holding on to straws? Are we and then now the report speaks to that same issue of global warming. And this is the reason why, in fact, this press release that came out last week, where CARICOM is appealing to the international community to support their review of graduation, this business of us graduating out of concessionary rates. And it's basically saying, per capita income, Prime Minister Prasad Besessa argues, was at best an arithmetic ratio that did not address levels of poverty, distribution of income, levels of indebtedness, vulnerability, and the capacity to self-generate sustainable economic and social development. I mean, this is the argument that we are placing before the international community, saying, listen, please, leave us poor.
Well, I would counter that by saying, I mean, from a lot of, and I think Michael would have mentioned it earlier, developed countries, citizens pay for a lot of the services that they consume. And so therefore, when you look at the profile across the Caribbean, there are lots of instances where we are pretty much social democracies, and things are provided free at delivery. And so therefore, any argument regarding, if that's the kind of argument you're putting forward, when you examine what is happening across the region relative to what's happening in developed countries, then I think that argument will be rather weak.
That's my point. I was in England a couple of years ago, and when I looked at what was happening in England, I realized that we were slowly but surely removing our arguments, because they were paying for stuff that we want to give away free. We want to give 100% mortgages and stuff like that.
Well, yes.
I like to see Michael's face like that, because I know something is coming.
I mean, it's true that there's been reform in the educational system in the United Kingdom, where students are being asked to pay more for their education. They have a much higher level of average income to a typical Caribbean country. So the argument has always been that, you know, if you can't afford to give it away for free, then someone should at least pay for it. I mean, can the government in the region afford to give all of the educational services away for free? And that's simply not sustainable. Or health services, all of the health services away for free. I mean, that's possibly not a sustainable model, given the fact that the population base is not growing, and therefore total taxes are slipping behind what they probably should be.
But I mean, it's a struggle with that. Let's put Ryan on point. The government has moved free education to UE. The opposition is opposing it. Isn't that the kind of conundrum that we have in this region that leaves us in no man's land?
I think the issue there is how you achieve the cost recovery. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, you have the opposition countering in each country. But the fundamental thing is that I think the government has signaled that something needs to be done about, and as to Michael's point, that you can't necessarily give everything away for free. Now, I think they could have done it a much cleaner way in terms of articulating how they're going to do the means testing and what have you. Because at the end of the day, given that we are small and pretty much our richest resource is the human capital, we still can't afford to limit access necessarily at that level, but certainly there needs to be something done there.
The students who come from all the other islands have to pay.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
What argument do you have?
I agree with you.
But Barbados is not asking to pay the full price.
It is the fact that you in this environment now, it is difficult to plan. I mean, it's something we were discussing off here. It's difficult to plan, and in the context of more taxation is a depressed economy. It's something that the government, I mean, obviously has to face. Has to make a decision on, but certainly in the context of students and households, it's something that's being done in the context of not being able to plan for next year, because obviously it's not it's not as if you know when your child is born you have to pay at the university. It's something that is actually literally on the doorstep, and I think that is something that I don't think there's enough time really for them to do the right kind of analysis
preparation
to get it done, because right now it's just a lot of uncertainty, but that said, I think is from my point of view, I would have preferred a post graduation recovery rather than a front cost. But there's several ways to do it, but that's the decision.
Let me just say to our viewers that and ask you to put up the number on the screen. We'll be taking your calls, and I'm sure that you have your own viewpoints on a lot of these issues, and you have stuff that you'd like to share. So the numbers are on the screen. Give us a call, or you can email us also at the address on the screen. You were going to say something about that, Mike.
I was saying that I don't think that the Barbadian government is asking for full payment.
No.
I think it's 48 or 50% of the total
Yeah,
cost.
but people, irrespective of that fact, are opposed to whatever.
Of course, there will be, everyone will be opposed if you're accustomed to getting something for free. But remember that Barbados' GDP per capita has been rising, so average incomes have been going up. Okay, costs have been going up as well, but I think that it just comes to the point where you have to inflict a dose of social responsibility, and you see young children today walking around with iPhones and walking around with other expensive gadgets, but then their parents claim that they can't pay for school books, or they can't pay for this, or they can't pay for that. So it's a matter of rationalizing your resources. It is going to be tougher on the average family to do it. Some sacrifices are going to have to be made, but that's just the trend towards becoming a first world country, is that you have to start requiring cost of social services to be paid by those who can afford it.
We have this story, we have the situation in Greece, and maybe it happened far away, and people in the region don't think it's a possibility that it will happen here. That the people of Greece found themselves. In fact, let me just invite them to put up a clip that was prepared on the story of Greece.
As Douglas Carswell MP said recently, Greece might be the first Western country to discover that you cannot keep running up debts to pay for a lifestyle you did not earn. She will not be the last. The laws of mathematics are universal.
Do you think the Caribbean people understand that? Do you think our leaders are sending the signal that what happened in Greece could happen in the region?
No, they are not. And certainly the laws of math are universal. Now, I think we have to be in the 21st century, and we're talking about debt and debt issues, but it is often difficult to even understand what is owed, or even how the debt has been accumulated, and in what areas, and because you can get the aggregate number, but you don't have no understanding as to how that was arrived at. You have the debt service. And I think that for politicians or whoever's in charge, you need to understand how you're actually generating this debt. And
you mean
in a lot of cases, they don't know.
What do you mean they don't know?
They don't know. I can tell you they don't know. They don't know. Because if they knew, they wouldn't be doing the things that they're doing.
They would do it because they want to save to get votes.
They do it to get, yes, but they don't understand. I think a lot of politicians don't understand the effects, the implications of it, yes, of what they do on the economy, certainly, and obviously on debt, and that's something. But generally speaking, people, because whether they're responding to the request of the electorate, people do not make the link between decisions taken in one area and how that translates to policy changes, whether it's introducing fees or higher taxes down the road, because they see things as not related. But everything is related in as far as the economy is concerned. There's some relationship that exists, and I think generally speaking in the Caribbean, we want to have nice roads, we want to have, whether it's free education, free health, or whatever, but there are consequences to that. And by not fixing problems as they arise, and kicking the can down the road, as the Americans like to say, then you find yourself in a situation where your economies are stalled for the most part. You're highly dependent on external intervention to help you. And so you find yourself in a situation where you're not even allowing your natural resources to actually work for you. And I think that's something that we have to come to grips with as a people, and certainly the business people, the political directorate, as well as the average citizen needs to realize that all the decisions that we take individually and collectively affect not just the outcome in terms of the economy, but certainly they have implications for the rising debt levels and debt service, both domestic and external, across the region.
Michael, you said earlier that we are almost at that point. Let's assume in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years we arrive at that point where we can't borrow anymore. Mm-hmm. What's the scenario in your mind? What do you see?
Well, a number of options. First, increase taxes. Second, cut social programs or ask the population to pay for it. Those finding a way to get debt relief, which perhaps is very difficult to achieve today.
Well, there are two sides to debt relief. Let me just introduce something I meant to a little bit earlier. It's the question of domestic borrowings, which have increased in government, and I want you to explain that, and borrowing from other sources. Let me let you guys tell the audience what those things mean. I could only point to them.
When governments run deficits, which they all do, they have to be financed, because you want to spend on whatever, whether it's social services, investment in infrastructure, even to service debt. It has to be financed, and the revenues, as we've been saying all evening, have pretty much declined simply because economic activity has stalled. So the difference between your revenue and expenditure, you need to borrow money to
repeat that thing. Whenever government falls behind, they need to do what?
They need not fall behind. It's not that they fall behind. You know, the
revenues I'm talking about.
The revenues are relatively fixed, given notwithstanding the structures across certain economies. There's only so much revenue you can get out of the economy at any point in time, right, because of the actual economic activity. The issue is that governments spend more than they're taking in any point in time. There are points where there's a small surplus, but generally speaking, they spend more than they earn in terms of revenue. And so that the difference has to be made up, and that's where the borrowing comes in, whether domestically or externally. Now, traditionally, I suppose for the banking system to work properly, you issue some treasury bills, probably 90 days, some 180 days, to help government with the cash, with the financial cash flow.
Make people to understand that those are borrowings by the government.
Borrowings by the government.
The borrowings
which you have to repay. Yeah. Now, over the longer term, obviously, governments would issue treasury bonds or savings bonds or what have you, and over the longer term, and this is where things like social security funds or even private pension funds would invest in, so that you can get your retirement. Well, hopefully when you get to retire, that you have something there to keep you whilst you're living up your sunset years. But the fundamental thing, and I think the point you're trying to get at is, given that you have an increase in government borrowing, and the ability to repay is rapidly diminishing. I think the concern for a number of persons, I think that where people might understand it, is that whether it's the Social Security Fund or the actual private pension funds that are invested, which are the largest investor class in any country, then you have to be very concerned about the government's ability to repay, because once they can't.
We come into that issue of the social security funds, but more importantly is the issue of the distinction I want between domestic rates and external rates. Because what is happening now, a lot of governments are borrowing domestically, like from the banking system and so on.
Well, yes, I mean, it's just a way of finance, as I said, of financing the.
Yes, it is, but which one is more expensive?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. If you borrow externally, obviously you have to earn foreign exchange to repay. Mm-hmm. There's a notion that if you borrow domestically, well, you just need to print some money and you can resolve that. But that's not necessarily always the case. And I don't think, certainly not in our neck of the woods, that you can just print money and not have any adverse effects down the road. But certainly, perhaps from our perspective, given the situation that we're in now, It is probably a good thing that we don't have as higher external debt service in the current environment where, as I said, inflows to the Caribbean have slowed. Now, there's always a balance. You need to have a balance between obviously domestic and foreign borrowing, but certainly once your system, once money is circulating in the economy, then and there's activity, once the economy is growing, then the ability to service any debt is not necessarily a problem so long as the economy is growing. When the economy stalls, then that becomes a problem for the debt, for the service of the debt. And that's where taxes and fees and all kinds of things start to come into the picture, because because when the government collects its revenue, the first thing it generally has to do is to set aside the funds for debt service.
Michael, you think that we are moving to the crunch where we might suddenly starting to see things like the interest rising for borrowings to the extent that governments have to pay more, finding themselves in a tighter squeeze?
Well, there's a risk premium associated with all lending, and if the profile of the government is such that they're having difficulty servicing their existing debts, the money may be available to them, but at higher interest costs. So yes, and secondly, within the United States, where the U.S. is clearly thinking about tapering off its quantitative easing, which is printing money to the tune of $80 billion a month. Interest rates are going to rise, and normally when you borrow internationally, it's based on an international flow, and then a risk premium associated with that. So going forward, it's going to be more expensive to borrow money internationally for those two reasons, because of the difficulty in servicing your existing loans, which makes it riskier, and also because interest rates are going to trend upwards over the next, say, 10 years or so.
You're making it sound long when you say 10 years. But, but let's look at the state that we're in. For example, St. Kitts, Jamaica, not Antigua, found themselves in a state where they had to restructure. Government bonds, in both instances, had to take a hit.
Well, what took the hit in Jamaica was the local investors who invested in
that's what I'm getting.
paper, and they called it a debt exchange, but really it was a financial haircut being taken by the investors in Jamaica, because they were exchanging debt at higher interest rates, but same debt at lower interest rates. So consequently, the net profits of those companies would decline. Yeah, they use a fancy term for debt exchange.
That's swapping.
Yeah.
But you made the point that that affected local investors.
Yes.
So, for example, in the Eastern Caribbean, we have the situation of CLICO, British American, where people have already lost significant amounts of monies, okay? And therefore, people have already suffered. Persons who have invested in bonds and treasury bills are now saying, is my government at the stage where I can also lose some of that? But let's take a break here. Let's take a break here. This is Time to Face the Facts, and we're looking at the debt, the national debt of the region, how we got here, how do we get out of here, and what does it really mean? We'll be right back in just a moment.
It's the end of the month again. My son's rent is due. Sending money to your children studying overseas is easy. Western Union's safe and reliable service lets you transfer money everywhere in the world. My son is doing well at school. That makes me proud. Western Union, moving money for better.
Agents in Grenada, Rennick Thompson and Company, with locations in Grenville, Sauterres, Guelph, Grand Anse, the Carnage, Bruce Street, and Carriacou.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
And welcome back to this edition of Time to Face the Facts. I'm Jerry George. My guests are Mr. Michael Julien and Ryan Straghn. And we're looking at the debt in the region and trying to come to grips with what it is, what does it mean, and can we do anything about it. Now, Michael, off mic, we were talking about this business of how do we restructure the region to deal with the situations that we have. Because currently, we're in a tough place. In fact, I have a statistic that says, for example, the foreign funds in the region make up some 320% of GDP, and banks own 149% of that. Are we really free?
You mean the foreign debt
Yeah.
in the region? Well,
No, not the foreign, the financial institutions.
yes. The financial institutions own
320% of GDP of the region.
I'm not understanding that statistic. Is it in terms of the loans that they
Yeah, in terms of owning the actual, well, not owning the loans, but they have those assets literally
yes.
under their control.
Yeah. Is that a bad thing or good thing?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah. Well, you know, generally, I think that the debt levels that have been maintained by individuals and private companies are way too high in the Caribbean, and we're now beginning to see signs, particularly where I live in Grenada, where there are many more foreclosures on properties. The banks have held off for a while. I understand that in St. Lucia that the bad debt levels have risen significantly in the financial system, and yeah, it's not necessarily a good thing for the region to have such outstanding obligations to the commercial banks or to the credit unions for that matter. But we've been brought up on a diet of excessive debt, and it's now the time where you will find that a higher percentage of the incomes of the population in the region will be set aside to pay down that and to reduce that debt.
But once you begin to make those adjustments, it speaks to the social fabric of the society, because when people realize that they're losing stuff, some people go literally crazy. Crime increases and things of that nature. How are we as a region prepared to deal with it, where crime already is pretty high?
Well, I don't know that we've even begun to put in place or to think about how to deal with these ramifications of the economic crisis that we face. It's extremely difficult situations. Every day I hear of friends whose homes are being foreclosed on. It's tough, but if you've sort of got yourself into that position, it's either you find a way to create sufficient liquidity to service those loans, or you have to give up the asset that you have acquired, which is a sort of the opposite of wealth creation. I don't want to call it poverty creation, but certainly losing a lot of the wealth that you have accumulated. And that's bad. I mean, it's going to happen over, let's just accept something, but for the next 10 years, at least for the next 10 years, that the region is going to have to tighten its belt, the government is going to have to tighten its belt, consumers are going to have to tighten their belts, and businesses are going to have to find a way to operate a lot more cost effectively than they do today. Those things are givens. And if they don't happen, we're looking at serious solvency issues regarding the ability of both companies and individuals and governments to service their loans. But it's going to be tough for a while.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Rat.
No, I think the IMF has conducted quite a number of financial sector assessments across the region over the last few years, and persons might hear terms like non-performing loans increasing and what have you. Essentially, what that means is again, it's private individuals, and we haven't spent a lot of time on the private side, but certainly the government, the countries or the public finances are in crisis. But similarly to private on the private side, there's a lot of debt on the private side which we haven't mentioned, and this is why growth is absolutely is important for growth to not just be maintained, but we actually have to ramp it up. So a number of the things that we would have discussed here are critically important. Yes, we have to do things, change our lifestyle. We may even have a lowering of your standard of living over the period, but you still must have growth over that period in order so that the sacrifice that you're making, the growth has to be there, so that at the end of that period, not necessarily at the end, but at the end, over that next 10 to 20 years, that you actually see an improvement, a genuine improvement of your standard of living. And your clip would have mentioned you can't related to the fact you haven't earned the standard of living. So
well, let's go to another clip.
It is something that
speaks to the issue of wealth, because you've mentioned that business of wealth quite a bit. We have a clip that speaks to the issue of wealth. Could we have that one, please?
As the crisis deepens, panic will take hold. In a desperate attempt to pay off the debts and try to regain control, politicians will cast around for any sources of money available and use almost any means to seize it. Invariably, that means they'll turn to their primary source of income, you. Just 2 years ago in Hungary, facing a debt crisis similar to our own, the government nationalized all pensions. In effect, they confiscated people's savings. Can you imagine waking up one day and being told that the income for the last 30 years of your life hangs on a government promise? In Greece right now, benefits have been cut to the bone. Salaries and pensions have been slashed up to 40%, and the retirement age has been hiked to generate more income from the population, the very victims of the crisis.
That's chilling.
It is indeed, and I think that when you hear things like debt restructuring in the region, debt swaps and all these things, what the clip would have pointed to the fact that pension funds and social security funds are the largest investors in government paper anywhere in the world. And so when you hear these things, it is the pension funds of private individuals and public sector workers as well, who are the largest investor class in the country.
And what that said, that's where the government goes
to get,
when they get into trouble.
Which essentially means that then they're promising to pay you less in the future.
I thought they were going there already. I thought
they had taken that already, but they might get worse.
I thought they had borrowed money, more and more money from the national insurance schemes.
From the schemes,
yeah, they've been borrowing.
But the private funds is the next phase.
Is the next target.
The private funds are actually the investors as well in the securities, and so therefore, whether it's debt restructuring or physically nationalizing those funds, that is where the next pot of money really is en masse in the economy. It is pension funds.
And which country did we hear people ended up one morning in the bank and the government told them they couldn't take out? Hungary.
Hungary. Cyprus. I think it was Cyprus. Yeah, Cyprus.
They couldn't take them out.
Yeah.
Do you think that people in the Caribbean really believe that's a possibility?
No, I don't think so. I don't think much thought has been given to that.
Is it a possibility?
Anything is possible.
I would say that yeah, anything is possible, but one has to be cautious about perhaps one has to allow the IMF and other mechanisms to work their way through the system to see how flexible those programs will be before speculating on the likelihood of
no, it's not speculation. It's just going to the ultimate. I mean, let me read something.
No, we just introduced tax on bank assets.
There you go. Wasn't there before? Let me read something. Why you mentioned the IMF, right? And the IMF is stating that they are supporting the growth agenda, and they're speaking to the financial assistance that they have given, and we're speaking particularly of these islands. Okay? It says the scale of loans approved in these islands was similar in terms of GDP to the rest of the hemisphere and in Europe, and substantially greater than in Africa. However, amongst disbursed at the end of 2011 were far larger in relation to GDP in the Caribbean than in those regions. The scale of funded financing to Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica and St. Kitts and Nevis in particular, was larger as its share of GDP than to any other countries in the rest of the hemisphere, including Mexico and Haiti. What the IMF is saying, we're helping you already. We're helping you far beyond the help that we've given to the region. You think they can keep it up?
I don't know if they can keep it up. What I do know, what is missing is a growth strategy that really makes sense. That's what's missing.
No, I agree with you. And that is why I think we're at the point of recognizing that we need to get really strong and firm on this growth strategy. We can't just talk about it. We have to do something about it. Because what the IMF is basically saying in this report is, listen, we're trying to help you to grow.
Yeah, I understand that. I think that there's a paucity of there is really, I mean, if you look at the national development plans for any average country, they will point to various sectors that they think can grow, or they will say that ICT and services and so on. But underpinning that, what you require is what one might call entrepreneurial ecosystems to support the growth, the build out of these sectors. And interestingly, I think in May in Africa, there was a economic growth forum which produced a very interesting set of information globally on what entrepreneurial ecosystems look like. And there are sort of 2 or 3 major features of them that run across the board in every region of the world. One is access to markets. The other is skilled labor force, a skilled workforce, and the third is access to finance. So one has to ask in the various territories whether or not we do have adequate trade agreements to allow for access to markets. I think we do.
Regionally?
Internationally we do.
Oh, internationally?
Yeah.
But we still have something, for example, let me go here, air transport. We still don't have an open skies agreement that allows us to move around.
Agreed. And
that is major if we have islands.
To stay on the subject, it's yes, there is reasonable level of market access which is not being exploited by the private sector as fully as it should. The workforce development initiatives are at a very moderate level by international standards. There aren't many countries. Barbados does have a workforce development fund, which is run through the TVET Council. Jamaica has one through Hart Trust, and then the NTA in Trinidad, National Training Agency, has one, I think, the government dispersing monies directly to businesses and subsidies to individuals, stipends to individuals who are trained. But the development of the workforce is not as yet a major agenda item in all various countries. And thirdly, access to finance. I started off my career as a financial expert 30 years ago, when access to finance was the #1 problem in the region, and 30 years later it's still deemed to be the #1 problem in the region, access to finance.
Let's go to our final break, and I'll come back to ask you why is that the case after 30 years. This is Time to Face the Facts. We're going to our final break, and we'll be back for our final moments with Michael Julien and Ryan Straghn. Don't go away.
If you want the eyes and ears of your customers, then there's only one place, Caribvision, the authentic channel for all things Caribbean, bringing you Caribbean news, Caribbean sports, Caribbean entertainment, Caribbean travel, and festivals. Advertise on the Caribvision platform, reaching across the Caribbean in over 21 countries, and now in the U.S. market on Cablevision in the New York tri-state area, and coming soon to Canada and the United Kingdom. Email us at sales@cmccaribbean.com. Caribvision, the eyes and ears of the Caribbean.
If you are serious about business, then log on and participate in Business Advantage. Every Monday, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., log on to www.niceradio.info. Business Advantage inspires you to believe that the man who wins is the one who thinks he can. Business Advantage with host Jerry George, mentoring the next generation of Caribbean entrepreneurs. 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays on www.niceradio.info. For further information, email caribbeaninformationhub@gmail.com. Like the Business Advantage Facebook page or call 1-784-456-5967 to participate.
Back for our remaining moments with Michael Julien and Ryan Straghn on this edition of Time to Face the Facts, where we're looking at the region's debt and what it really means. You said you started your career 30 years ago. Access to finance was the issue. What's the problem still?
Well, a large percentage of the private sector is now informal. Interesting statistic is that about two-thirds of the firms in the Caribbean finance their operations from internally generated funds. Only 23% of them seek out financing from commercial banks or from other lenders.
Why do you think that is the case?
I think because, partly because the mix of the private sector has changed dramatically, so the banks are not prepared to lend to individuals. There's an absence of credit bureau information in the Caribbean, so they don't want, the risk profiles of the borrowers are much higher than they should be. Companies are struggling because there's more competition between the firms for a market, a domestic market size that's not growing. As I said, the population bases aren't growing of these countries. So unless you have very buoyant external influences such as tourism, strong tourism growth, then it becomes riskier for the banks to lend to the private sector. And the interest rates while interest rates have come down on mortgages, they aren't that much lower on commercial loans. So yeah, I think that's the explanation.
Let me rush towards the end here. So one of the things that we heard, I think was Moody, was talking about, particularly in case of the Eastern Caribbean dollar, about devaluation. And people jumped up and says, well, no, everything is okay, all is fine. That specter is one that we all hate. What is the possibility and the reality?
Well, I think the IMF said that in terms of purchasing power parity, that the value of the Eastern Caribbean dollar should be effectively, the Eastern Caribbean dollar was overvalued by about 23%. And that, in fact, if you were to take into consideration a rate that would allow you to balance your external accounts, your exports and your imports, that rate would be a lot higher. So one could be looking at a possible effective rate that is 50% as much as 25 to 50% lower than the 2.7 to 1 US dollar that it is. But that devaluation only occurs if a central bank runs out of foreign exchange reserves. I'm not sure that the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank is anywhere near that position at the moment.
I agree, but the point is that since they have mentioned it, it's in somebody's head.
Yes.
And that's my concern.
Yeah.
Why would they mention it if there was not a possibility? Let me go to a central bank.
Well, the issue with the evaluation in our context is that we simply aren't producing anything that the world would want that would help the situation, because you would want that whatever you're producing domestically for export, that becomes theoretically cheaper. So therefore, the demand for it then theoretically should increase. But we're not producing anything at the scale, across the OECS or even in the region particularly, that would help on that side. Certainly, what it would do is make imports more expensive, so you can balance on that side. But but Michael is absolutely right. The mechanics of a devaluation, and it's not even so much about the central bank. It really comes down to whatever the black market, when you have a situation where your normal operation in terms of going to the banks or whatever to get foreign exchange isn't working, the black market takes over. And once the black market so it's not so much about what the central bank has or doesn't have, but certainly the black market has a more important role at that point, and you're talking about foreign exchange rationing and those kinds of issues, things taking longer to go through the normal process before you even get to that stage. But I think the context though is that it doesn't matter what the rate is, you still have to earn, you still have to grow, and I think that has to be. It's on the cards. It is a possibility for any country, as you can see. It has happened in the region. But whatever you do, you still have to go and earn your way in the world. And I think that in the context of resolving the debt problem, we have to focus strongly on growth.
Let's deal with that quickly, because we're rushing out of time. We agreed that tourism is falling. That's where we earn a lot of our foreign exchange from. In the other islands, banana is under threat. There are some who see the possibility of a recovery from bananas. The financial services have taken a hit themselves, okay, because of the OECD countries and stuff. What in the region at this point in time do we have, looking forward, that will say to all of us, we have something to offer so that we can earn foreign resources? What do we have left?
I think we have to focus on
something for real, something that is working tomorrow.
We have, well, I don't know about tomorrow. I think energy in the region, energy production or consumption in the region, we have to focus on very strongly, because I think the focus there has to be on bringing the cost of whatever it is we're doing down. And I think in so doing, that gives us a little space, certainly in terms of spending on foreign exchange for energy consumption in particular. I think whether it's geothermal in Dominica or solar in Barbados or wherever else, I think that has to be part of the very immediate mix of policy going forward. I think though that tourism, we tend to focus more on the United States and the UK and Canada, and I think that has been to our detriment, because we simply don't invite the rest of the world to come to the Caribbean.
I have to cut you. I'm going to give you 20 seconds and 20 seconds. You start with your 20-second wrap-up.
Okay. I mean, as I said, the growth is absolutely fundamental for the next 10 to 20 years, I think, to help to resolve these issues. Some hard decisions will have to be taken. I think the population have to pay close attention to the decisions that are being made, and be mindful that there are consequences, and you must solve the problem.
I think we're taking the wrong approach. It's not what we have to do. I think it's who is going to do it. And if we don't have the people in the region who are going to do it, we need to bring in people with the brains and with the ideas to build out these new ideas so that we can have genuine growth.
I must cut you there. This has been this month's edition of Time to Face the Facts. We've looked at the debt in the region, and we've looked at its implications and some of the possibilities. Helping us has been Mr. Michael Julien and Ryan Straghn. I'm Jerry George. So long.